Hi, Adam.
Hey, it's kind of lonely in the office.
They left us alone here.
Yeah.
What are you reading lately?
I've been reading Manhattan Projects.
You recommended that to me. I checked that out a little bit.
Which is take a little bit of crazy and then ladle on a remarkable amount of crazy and put it in a quasi-historical setting.
Yeah, it's a bit Bioshock-ish almost.
Yeah, except it's like in a particle accelerator. I don't think I've ever actually read a comic book that seems to move at the speed and the velocity of this one.
Yeah, it's a little bit like Mars Attacks if instead of Martians it was historical figures. Yeah, I'm really into Saga right now.
The Brian Vaughan Saga. I mean, but you said they're taking a break.
Yeah, he's on a hiatus until like September or something, and I'm dying for issue 13 or 14 or whatever they're on. Why are we talking about comics? This is a show about video games, right?
Well, you did the Deadpool review.
I did do the Deadpool review. Yeah, that's a game that I've been a Deadpool fan for a long time.
Okay, so I am so not a Deadpool fan. Also, I'm not the biggest Marvel fan. I am the weirdos that just, I kind of grew up with DC and my affinities there.
You're old. You like that golden age
I like that golden age operatic stuff. But so the whole idea of breaking the fourth wall with Deadpool, something I usually don't find a problem in all other forms of entertainment, it gets me in comic books. I can't figure it out.
There's something so static about them, and they've been around for so long that it's something. I feel like it's when he addresses the viewer or acknowledges the fact that he's in a comic book, there's something so almost spontaneous about it, even though that it is it is a static medium. It's sort of just, we're so used to it kind of following a certain path. I mean, Bugs Bunny did it all the time.
Right, and it completely makes sense there. I think it's because Bugs Bunny doesn't carry the burden of canon the way that comic books do, and that's where I'm sort of surprised. I would think that it's hard then to integrate Deadpool into the larger Marvel universe if you have someone who's so hyper aware of the entire lie that is the Marvel universe.
I think what's interesting is Deadpool's kind of blown up with the popularity of the internet and sort of meta stuff, and it's like he's kind of almost a wiki superhero. Like he reacts to the kind of the audience as much as he does to he echoes the opinions of the fan community around stuff that's happening in
He's kind of like the fool or the clown in a Shakespeare play.
Yeah.
Who's just kind of like, hey audience, I know what you're thinking. It's so funny none of these guys seem to be aware of it here.
Of course, he makes a perfect fit for a video game character because he's got A, regenerative health, and B, he can pick up any weapons and use them, and C, he addresses the viewer, so there's no ludonarrative dissonance there. And he's completely insane, so anything that's happening that doesn't quite make sense, you're like, oh, well, it's Deadpool's video game. Of course it's going to be kind of stupid.
To that extent, it strikes me as a little bit surprising that there hasn't been a game based on Deadpool yet. Also, was someone already thinking about games when they designed Deadpool? I mean, it's almost too perfect.
I feel like it's a surprise that Rob Liefeld hasn't gone into games more. Because his thing is he likes gigantic guns and he hates drawing feet. So by all logic, he should be working on first-person shooters. Like pouches and guns. That's what that guy likes.
So when you started out reading comic books, what did you start with? Like, what was your gateway drug?
The first comics I remember ever buying were it was a Captain Planet and the Planeteers.
Wow.
That had Duke Nukem, not the video game one, but the guy in the Hawaiian shirt trying to mess up the Everglades, and then another one that was Tailspin. And I just remember being in the comic store and it being this amazing, very fascinating, mysterious place where I didn't know what anything was. And that's something that's always been intimidating for comics about me, is that there's so much there, and it's like there's so much that hasn't been cataloged and digitized and made accessible instantly, that there's things that there's rarity. There's a certain kind of archaeology to comics.
No. You just reminded me that you always have your comic book store. Because very few comic book stores are organized in a rational way. They're in a way that you become accustomed to. And I used to go to Comic Relief in Berkeley, and I believe it's now gone away, which is it breaks my heart that I returned to find it gone. And then they moved locations. Well, I was living in LA and I came back up and I wanted to get some stuff. And I suddenly couldn't interact with it. it was like I had such a set pattern and way that I moved around it and knew where to find stuff. So it was panic-inducing.
The first two comic shops I went to were Newbury Comics near Harvard Square in Cambridge, which is essentially East Berkeley, East Coast Berkeley.
Yeah.
And there was another one around the corner there, but I remember going to those two because I lived, in the neighborhood. I went back as an adult, and I was like, I can go to comic shops on my own. And I found one of them, and it was sort of, it was smaller than I remembered it. I think it had moved like 2 doors down. And I was sort of like, this is sort of sad. And I was like, is Newbury Comics still around? And they're like, are you serious? I'm like, where is that? They're like, go around the corner. Newbury Comics is now this giant citadel of things that I like. It's like toys and movies and music and leather jackets and a tattoo parlor and a piercing place and a bar and like a pizza place and still comics there. And I'm just like, this place. So I mean, if a comic shop relocating is one thing, then having it just transform into this Voltron of stuff you like is something else entirely. I got into Marvel Comics through the X-Men cartoon, like I know a lot of people my age did. And I went through the trading cards and the toys, and it was kind of like all that stuff at once. And then I inherited a massive stack of 80s X-Men. Just like mid, 85 through 87, around that era, which is a really, really good period.
Very good era. They were like kind of hyper popular at that point.
Oh yeah, but they were still a little bit punk rock. Like they weren't, the Avengers. They weren't like mainstream. They were still like a little bit kind of edgy. And before Wolverine had blown up and become,
Wolverine.
The icon. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Before he'd become how Deadpool is now. But yeah, I mean that was so funny because that was stuff that was released when I was being born. So it's not really my era of comics, and I was so busy kind of catching up on old stuff that
you still kind of okay, that's very interesting. I mean, I remember my first comic I got, and this is after much finagling for probably the 75 cents off of my parents, but it was Secret Wars 1. And what was fascinating is that's the dumbest thing to start with.
Oh yeah.
Because it's so steeped in having to know about everything else to actually appreciate it, that sort of that and some other missteps, I just, in the limited amount of money I could get off my parents. But it was going into that comic relief store, I would say it was 1987, as there were so many shifts happening in the comic book industry, and I picked up Kyle Baker, and I believe Andrew Helfer wrote this very fascinating run of The Shadow. And that's when on DC Comics it would just say for mature audience.
Oh yeah,
It'd be really, really small. I was like, ooh, and like all these rules were violated of what was supposed to happen. I mean, here you have this hero who's just slaughtering people. It was like that sense of something naughty's happened, and that's like my memory of especially that late '80s buying comics, was trying to find the thing that seemed to be the least indicative of what comic books were. Which there's one. I'm probably shouldn't even talk about this with you. Howard Chaykin wrote a borderline pornographic series, but involved vampires and stuff, called Black Kiss. Which
I've heard of that, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how they thought it was acceptable to sell that to me at the age of 14, or maybe I just looked really mature and
really,
put a
he probably looked like a really horny little kid. Like, get this guy out of our store before he makes a mess.
But it was, that was one of those fascinating things, and then I got really into Cerebus. Because it was so high concept, so crazy, and like that's where it's like I love like trying to figure out what the lore was and how all these things fit together.
Yeah, I mean that's going back to what I said. That's what I love about comics. Is there is so much there that it's kind of like the ocean. And it's so much of it has never been mainstream. It's always been kind of this weird back corner thing. It's some of it's you get weird indie things that show up, labels that disappear over the course of a couple years.
I mean, exactly. It is kind of, I guess, like indie games where it's like we're going to have our little conversation over here that doesn't have to bother anybody else, and we're going to figure something out.
Yeah, games for the most part though have always been the amount of money it takes to produce a game means that you will find a record of it. There's very little kind of stuff that kind of disappears in the sands of time. I mean, there's a handful of weird NES carts and things like that, but nowadays I think we're starting to get to a point where there is that kind of, I would say we are right now in gaming where comics were in the mid '80s. Yeah. And that you've got your AAA stuff that's starting to kind of reach like a mainstream audience. You've got your stuff that's turning heads, like The Last of Us. You could say that's I wouldn't call it the Citizen Kane of games. I would call that maybe the Dark Knight Returns of games.
I agree.
It is a zombie game where you shoot stuff, but yeah, it's doing something interesting. And then you've got a lot of indie stuff that finally has the kind of
your Love and Rockets, your all that kind of great stuff from there. No, that's a good analogy. I think the one thing is Deadpool being maybe one of the few exceptions that going back and reading the comic books, there's action stuff that happens in it, but you appreciate the action for the parts that don't have the action.
Exactly.
And I think that's what makes it so hard to translate stuff so effectively over to a game, is you don't get the quality downtime that makes, you know, the high velocity, excitement, you know, turning point stuff, you know, carry all that meaning.
If the Deadpool game had been flawless combat and action with none of the personality that I liked, I would have probably given that game a lower score instead of having, you know, vaguely janky combat and a ton of personality that actually sat right.
And it was respectful to what the original source material was. It sounds like a rare instance.
Yeah, they can't all be Arkham Cities. There were a whole lot of turds of Batman games before those games came along.
Batman Begins had a game. Catwoman had a game. Oh,
let's not forget Batman Forever for the Super Nintendo. Ouch.
Actually, let's.